So, my name is David. I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of the Irish chapter of Anti-Corruption International. So, thank you for taking the time to come in, and also welcoming our international colleagues who are tuning in at the moment from all around the world, from the Philippines to the United States and everywhere in between. So, I'll hand you over to Jay, the International President of Anti-Corruption International, who will make the opening remarks.
Okay, so I'll just give the opening word really quickly. So basically, ACI, which will be probably told is relatively new, it's a little over 2 months old. The development has been really rapid. We have national chapters being established around the world, and I'd like to just give the opening speech on why Anti-Corruption International is necessary. So, it's been said that the accomplice to the crime of corruption is our own indifference. This is essentially what allows corruption to persist, to permeate and to pervert our society, and our sense of justice and our movement towards development. But this does not affect our society alone. This is not a problem that afflicts one country or one culture alone. Every state around the world has some degree of corruption, and that's where ACI comes in. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jason Deegan, and I'm the founder of ACI. And I'm fed up. I'm fed up of being a young person who's been told that we're the future, but neglecting to give us a voice in the present. I'm fed up of being part of a generation who will inherit a world where we live in segregated islands of wealth, while many of our friends from around the world are struggling to stay afloat. I'm fed up of seeing large multinationals consistently push this planet we call home towards destruction by constantly attacking our environment. I'm tired of this being allowed to happen. I'm fed up of hearing and seeing other young people around the world hate and kill each other for corrupt leaders. I'm fed up of being told we're apathetic and that we don't care, when in reality, we're not apathetic. We're just fed up of playing a rigged game. We're tired of signing petitions that don't impact what will happen. ACI is as much about empowerment as it is about education and discussing policies. We're a movement, and a movement to ensure empowerment of the people standing shoulder to shoulder with us against corruption. I started ACI because I'm tired of being fed up. I'm tired of talking about our problems, our communities, our countries, and our planet faces. I'm tired of empty promises. I'm tired of talking. Only by action, only by movement can we see change. Be sure of one thing, ACI is a movement, a global movement, that seeks to give young people the chance to level the playing field, the chance to hold the powers that be to account, to see a world where power is not abused, where the phrase we all hold so close to our lips when we mention corruption, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, becomes irrelevant, where we can see a world where our politics is not made behind closed doors, where we can see and that we can ensure that decisions made in our name are for the benefit of us all and for the benefit of our planet. It is said that an error does not become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. Well, I stand here urging us all to begin to correct it. Begin to correct the systematic error that is corruption. It simply doesn't work and isn't a stable or fair way for society to develop. When deals that undermine education are allowed to happen unbeknownst to us, when deals that destroy or defund our hospitals are allowed to affect the health of us all, and deals that destroy our environment are allowed to go on, where we can't see it being done, but in our name, it is certainly being done. We stand here on the precipice. A change is no longer a desire simply for idealists. A change is essential. It is the defining issue of our time, of our generation. What change do we make? Who makes it, and who benefits from it? Do we continue to look to our left and to our right and say, I'm getting by, everything is okay? Or do we instead say, until we all flourish, none of us do? We stand here in a city that's plagued by corruption, a country where assets leaving the state's hands go comfortably into the hands of the very people who are filling the politicians' pockets. We stand in a city that allows companies from impoverished African states to use our tax system to allow poverty to persist. We are by no means a corruption-free society, and as much as we must stand against corruption around the world, we similarly must stand against corruption here in Ireland. We stand here in a state that the OECD recognises as a state that implements little to no enforcement of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which ensures that we prioritise good business practices overseas. We allow our companies to engage in corruption simply because it is convenient to not question the job creators. Kurt Cobain famously said, it is the duty of the youth to challenge corruption. Well, I'd go a step further and say that true challenging corruption is the duty of the youth to challenge injustice, inequality, intolerance, and to shine a light on the forces that allow such diseases to continue to haunt the world. So this is just a long-winded way of saying that ACI is coming to Ireland and ACI is needed here in Ireland and around the world. So I won't speak for much longer, but what I will do is I'll introduce the panellists. So this is John Devitt, the Head of Transparency International Ireland. And then we have Brendan O'Rourke and John Hogan, who are academics in Dublin Institute of Technology, who've been working in the area of lobbying, conflict of interests, and other areas like that. So what we'll do is I'll invite the panelists to give a short speech, short talk, and then we can open up for questions. So if you do have any questions, please do feel free to ask. And thank you.
Jason, how long do you want to speak for? About 10 minutes or so?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll keep track of it here on the phone. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to Jason and everyone with Anti-Corruption International for inviting me. And I'm very pleased to be able to take part in the launch of this very important group. I think it's important that young people are engaged in the fight against corruption. I was young once myself when I started Transparency International 12 years ago here. I was in my late 20s, technically still young, and as you can see from my beard and my receding hairline, it has aged me somewhat. I do hope you will stick in there, because this is a long-term struggle. This is not going to be fought and won over the next few years. This is a struggle that will last hundreds of years. Corruption has been with us for as long as people have been organising themselves in societies, or as long as governments have been established and people have been elected to public office. Power has been abused everywhere since the beginning of modern history. Transparency International, for those of you who are not familiar with us, was founded back in 1995 by a group of retired international civil servants, people working with the World Bank and the United Nations and so on. And since 1995, the organisation has grown into a movement of around 100 chapters. The Irish chapter here is a small organisation with 2 full-time members of staff and 2.5, depending on what projects we're working on at any one time. And like Anti-Corruption International, our goal is to raise awareness, is to inform the public, to inform decision makers of the cost of corruption and measures that we can introduce to tackle this problem, which has cost the Irish taxpayer, Irish citizens, billions of euros. We can see this over the last few years through the bailout of our banks that we've lost well over 30 billion euros, arising from many different types of wrongdoing, not necessarily defined as corruption in and of itself, but arising from abuses of power and a failure to stop abuse, to stop or to check conflicts of interest. And corruption isn't seen as a particularly big problem by the international community here in Ireland. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index tells us that Ireland, relatively speaking, is not that corrupt. That's relatively speaking. Ireland is ranked 17th out of 175 countries on the Corruption Perceptions Index. Those countries that are perceived to be least corrupt appear at the top of the index. Those that are perceived to be most affected by corruption are at the bottom. So at the top you see countries like Denmark, New Zealand, most of the Scandinavian countries. Ireland is in that second sector, or second tier of countries which are perceived to be relatively clean by international standards. But when you look at those countries that are almost directly below Ireland, you'll see that this situation isn't as bright as one might first believe it to be. And I've travelled quite a bit with Transparency and seen the scale of corruption up front in many parts of the world, in Central Asia or East Asia. I've seen police officers who are drunk on duty, leaning against trees, walking in front of cars, stopping the taxi driver, taking the taxi driver out the back of the car, and the taxi driver would have a bottle of vodka to give to the police officer. In Russia, you pay $20,000 to get into the police academy, so you can then make more money as a traffic police officer. In Georgia, about 15 years ago, the entire traffic police corps was fired because of rampant corruption. Back in the 1970s, the Drug Enforcement Agency, well over 80% of the Drug Enforcement Agency officers were on the take from heroin dealers, drug smugglers. That was in New York. And we have suffered from different types of corruption here. When we don't, the problem doesn't seem to manifest itself in the same way that it does in Indonesia or Tajikistan or Kazakhstan, places where petty corruption, what's known as petty corruption, official corruption, is rampant, where doctors, nurses, teachers, everyone is engaged in the informal economy and sees it as corruption as a means to make a living. Thankfully, our police officers, generally speaking, are clean. We have had exceptions. We worked with two of the whistleblowers, Morris McCabe and John Wilson, in exposing abuse of the Garda traffic management records. But you won't be stopped by police officers or immigration officials at Dublin Airport and asked for a ride. You won't be pulled over and asked for money to get away with a speeding ticket. That generally does not happen here. Corruption has manifested itself in a more subtle way more recently. We go back to recent history. Corruption was a big deal in politics. The modern history of corruption begins with Charles Haughey, former Prime Minister, who received in the region of £8 million from business people. There was not necessarily a quid pro quo involved, but he was very much very close to those who helped him live the lifestyle that he became accustomed to. Charles Haughey was on a salary of around £14,000, I think, at the beginning of the 1980s, and he owned his own yacht, he owned his own private island, a mansion, race horses. He lived a lifestyle of a multi-millionaire. And our tribunals of inquiry, these truth commissions that helped expose corruption not just in our political elites or among our political elites, but in our local authorities as well. They showed how money was changing hands to change the use or designation of land from agricultural use to residential or commercial use for relatively small amounts of money, £1,000 here, £2,000 there, to change the use of land from agricultural to use for housing or for business. This increased the price of land by tenfold in many cases, and there was an incentive for people to pay bribes to local politicians to change the way in which land was used. The Mann Tribunal, which was a tribunal of inquiry which lasted around 15 years, found that corruption was systemic in local government up until the early 1990s. And the government has gone some way to address the kind of corruption that was engaged in by Charles Haughey and by local councillors. So it has introduced requirements to disclose assets and political donations. It has put caps on the amount of political donations that political parties can receive or candidates can receive. And it has introduced registers of interests that local authority members and senior officials in local authorities have to fill in so that people can see whether there is a conflict of interest when deciding on land use in future. More recently, it's introduced whistleblower legislation. It's introduced a register of lobbyists, John, I'm sure, will talk about. And we've seen some movement. We've seen a lot of reform, on paper at least, over the last few years. The problem is that very many of the people who have been engaged in wrongdoing of some form or another, or who have questions to answer about their dealings with politicians, have never been held to account. So, for example, the Moriarty Tribunal, which had investigated the source of income or payments to senior politicians, including Charles Haughey, also found that there was during the course of the award of a licence for Ireland's second mobile telephone contract, that €1 million in payments and benefits were made by a wealthy man who shall remain nameless for now, and the Minister for Communications, Michael Lowry, who was found to be corrupt. And this billionaire has gone on to bigger and better things. He's now owner of Ireland's largest newspaper group. He is owner of Ireland's largest chain of petrol stations. He owns the biggest engineering company responsible for installing water meters in Ireland. He's had a lot of money, millions of euros, written off in loans that he owed state-owned bank IBRC, and has just won an injunction against RTE, the Irish state broadcaster, not to disclose his dealings with that bank. There has been no movement by the Director of Public Prosecutions to follow through on the findings of the Moriarty Tribunal. We found this man had made these payments to the Minister for Communications back in the late 1990s. Lesson here we can draw, and you pointed to the lack of enforcement of the OECD Convention, is that we've been quite good at reacting to past scandals, introducing measures to improve transparency, but we really suck at accountability, at holding people to account. Our criminal justice system is not geared to stopping very serious white-collar crime. It's not good at even questioning those who are alleged to have engaged in wrongdoing. And until that changes, I don't see any serious move against corruption here in Ireland. And the culture of impunity that breeds is infectious, and it also breeds a great deal of cynicism and scepticism towards our decision makers, to institutions of government, and breeds distrust amongst citizens of their leaders. The last few days have been a welcome break from the conversation we've been having around site-serve, around a lot of things that are bad about Irish society. It's nice to be talking about Ireland for a different reason, for a change. But we'll have to really focus our energies again on ensuring that Ireland becomes better at accountability. And I think that's one of the challenges, again, Anti-Corruption International, as well as groups like Transparency International, will have to meet. And I really look forward to working with you in making Ireland a much more accountable country.
I look forward to working with you as well. If John Hogan would like to speak, just one short thing before you do. Ed Gross, who is the international board representative for the region, we have 8 regions, and this region that we're in now is North America, Western Europe. So Ed Gross will be getting up to speak shortly after the last 2 panelists. I forgot to introduce you, so my apologies.
My name is John Hogan, and I work in the Dublin Institute of Technology, and I suppose over the last 10 years with colleagues Raz Charlie in Trinity College Dublin and Gary Murphy in DCU, we've kind of investigated lobbying regulations globally, and this was long before there was any lobbying law here. It's only just recently come in the last while. And I suppose our research was kind of driven by the government initially, that we did a report for the government on what the trends internationally were in terms of lobbying regulations. And we wanted to kind of, I suppose, see what standards are expected in other places around the world, whether in Europe or North America, and how lobbyists are regulated, how they're controlled, how their behaviour is monitored. And it's not really about interfering, in the relationship between citizens and their representatives or people talking to their politicians. It's just really about, trying to make more transparent what goes on in terms of, moneyed interest, talking to politicians and lobbying them and trying to influence political decisions. And I suppose it goes back to the old idea of kind of shining a light into the black box of policy making. So how are policies made? who's involved in that process, who's influencing the process. And the idea that, I suppose in this country being a republic, and the Latin definition of a republic is a public concern. So it's all our concern. These people work for us. If they're making decisions, it's our money they're making decisions with. So, why shouldn't we know? What's the harm in knowing? And if there's something, they want to hold from us, well then, they've got questions to answer. So what our research really does is just kind of compares different jurisdictions around the world, looks at the regulations they have in place for lobbyists, and sets out to score them on an index running from 0 to 100 in terms of which are the most highly regulated, which are medium, which are low regulated. And over the last number of years then we've spoken, particularly with the Irish government, we've been consulting with them as they've developed their lobbying law, which was signed by the President in March. And myself and John were at the event there a little while ago where they launched the register down in Woodkey. Minister Holland launched it. And we're going to see now, I suppose, over the next 12 to 14 months how the register works here. At the same time we were talking to the Irish government, we were over in Britain talking to the British government and kind of meeting some of their committees which were interested in bringing in a lobbying law in Britain. And it'll just be interesting to see how the Irish and British lobbying laws, how they work out, because they were brought in around the same time, and they seem to be already diverging in terms of what's happened in Britain with their lobbying law. And our objective really is, I suppose, for countries to look at the regulations that we've examined, to see if they can learn from them, to see if they can kind of, learn from what's out there, and basically bring in lobbying regulations that will help their own societies. Because what I suppose worries us is where countries seem to go off on a tangent and think that they can reinvent the wheel without looking at other examples. Like, as one of the countries we've examined a lot was Australia, and Australia has dabbled in lobbying regulations a number of times. They implemented them in the 80s, they got rid of them in the 90s, they tried to bring them back in again in the 90s. They don't seem to have worked out very well, and at the same time they don't seem to have sent fact-finding missions to other countries to see what, America's been dealing with regulating lobbies for the last nearly 150 years. So there's lots of lessons there to be learned. And why you think you can, do it all from scratch when you can bring in experts from other places is questionable, I suppose. But that's what we do.
I'm Brendan O'Rourke. I have the pleasure of working with John in Dublin Institute of Technology in the College of Business there. I'm not directly involved in the study of lobbying like John is, but I think I have some interesting things to say about corruption more generally. But before I do that, I really want to praise all of you who come together to form this. Jason, you talked of being very tired. I can't do as much as you've done to engage in this kind of activity, even when I'm feeling very fresh in the morning. So, given that I know a lot of people who've been involved in this campaign, have been involved in other interesting campaigns in Ireland recently, I would like to really praise ye. It's wonderful for an old fecker like me to see this enthusiasm coming from the youth. It really is uplifting. It might even give me some energy one of these days, if not as much as Jason. The second thing I'd like to do is, Transparency International has been fantastic, and it's great to see them welcoming a sister organisation, if you like, into the field and encouraging and showing up. So I think that is fantastic. Sorry, I'm an academic, so I have to talk about my research to some extent and how it connects with corruption. As I say, I'm not as aligned with the study of corruption per se as closely as John Hogan's work on lobbying is. But what does strike me is the insidious nature of corruption, and it is great to hear about the Irish lobbying regulation and how strong that regulation is. But I grew up in a political culture that was very different in terms of a state that had been was reasonably free of corruption, at a mega level anyway, until the rise of Charles Haughey. And those were very dark days, and I think it's a good thing that the Irish experience is being contributed to the overall experience and the international experience of the States, because we were very, very close to becoming an extremely corrupt area during that period.
And I think our knowledge and experience of that and climbing out of it to the degree that we have, and I accept there are still problems, but I think, you know, our 17th place on the scale is a testament to that work. You know, it shows how you can nearly be very corrupt. It's a close thing. And this really emphasises the chapter that you're setting up in Ireland, the importance of keeping at this. It slips back very easily. People and your actions make a difference. So I think that's one thing I'd like to say. The other thing I'd like to say is I'm wary of corruption sometimes, and I think, or talk about anti-corruption, because there are certain models, I don't think they're in this room, but there are certain models of corruption that really focus on pedantic regulation keeping. And for instance, I think we need to remember that some of the regulations in Ireland are getting worse on that front. You know, there has been attempts to get people in the health service and indeed in universities and so on to toe the line in a way that might be justified if you looked at public services as commercial enterprises, where increasingly public servants are portrayed as people who should do exactly what the bosses tell them to do, regardless of their obligation to act in the public interest. And I think that's an important, you know, we're in danger sometimes of regulating out of existence the resistance to corruption itself. And you saw this in the financial crisis. You saw how even, and I'm not great fans of the Department of Finance, but even the Department of Finance was put under extraordinary pressure to shut up about dangers it saw in the economy. Okay? It was undermined, in my view, by a series of governments that, if you take Charlie McCreevy's dealing with, for instance, the what he called where it was decentralisation. He has admitted publicly, when he was commissioner in Europe, he has admitted publicly how he went behind public servants' backs because he didn't want any opposition to them. That, to me, is as important as, if you like, more straightforward and obvious corruption, because it's undermining the independent action that public servants need to have. And I think there's a great danger in that, and it's a kind of second wave. Once we've got beyond the haughty era, once we've got beyond that very gross corruption, we've now got to, I think the next stage for somewhere like Ireland, and maybe colleagues from, you know, more advanced areas in the area of anti-corruption, like the Nordic countries, can comment. But what we need is active public servants and others in different organisations to be able to whistleblow, to be able to critique, not to be afraid to argue against prevailing opinion. Contacts with Anti-Corruption International, and it's, you know, it's the kind of thing, I know already we've posted the existence of Anti-Corruption International on our students' pages and stuff, and I know it's not just Jason's charisma, but it's a genuine interest by even business students in, and I'm teasing, business students are generally quite ethical at the beginning anyway, until they're corrupted. But, you know, I think there's a genuine hunger to explore this, to deepen this, to enable people to, you know, raise up their voices and be critical, which is desperately needed to stop corruption flourishing. So thanks very much and good luck.
I'll just pass over to Edgar, so just give us a short update.
Well, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Ireland and in Dublin, and I came from Sweden, and I'm representing the region of North America and West Europe. So basically a little bit of data. I will speak a little bit about the region itself and what our plans are and maybe how we can cooperate and so on. So basically we have 26 countries in the region. By North America we only mean the US and Canada. Out of those 26 countries, we would like to involve in 1 year, basically we would like to involve 19 countries in the movement of Anti-Corruption International, and that means that we would like to have 13 national chapters, because some countries would be basically merged together for one national chapter, for instance, as having 5 Scandinavian countries of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Finland? Yeah, I was thinking that I said it before. Merging them into one chapter, for instance, the countries of Benelux, to have them together as well, because they share similar problems and would probably be more productive in a sense. Because I really liked what you mentioned, that people should not be afraid of speaking, because that's what I want to do in my region, that we could help people, for instance, from regions that are less advantaged, for instance, who cannot speak openly about the problems, who cannot, I don't know, go and manifest on the street because they might die or be imprisoned or something. So we would like to be the voice, for instance, getting information, let's say, from Uganda and publishing it in Europe or in North America, that people would be cautious that certain bad things are happening and that they cannot fight them alone, so that we have to somehow be maybe the mediator between, let's say, the government and people. So we have to mediate and find the solution together, probably, because in general I really love about ACI how we shaped it, that it should be an organization where one country or one region, let's say, learns from another. It's not that, you know, you cannot fight corruption alone. So basically, if we take some measures from our region, we can try and help, for instance, people maybe in South America or in Southeast Asia and so on, maybe using the same or similar adapted measures to fight corruption there as well, because it's basically we are standing here for the same common good. So it should not be that. It should not be a competition, and I do not see that, you know, in any way the region, our region where Ireland is, would be excluded or something. And I would like to encourage as well people who are watching, and you all, and Academia Transparency International. I'm very involved in Transparency International movement in Lithuania, by the way. Yeah. And I would like to encourage, to promote us, that we would get more support from people, because it's very challenging, I think, to work in this region, because a lot of people do not see direct threat that corruption brings, because they think like, okay, I get my salary, I can buy food, I can drive to work, I don't know, I have my family, I can go out, I can do this and that, and they do not think that, for instance, a lot of money just goes somewhere, or that somebody is not as equal as somebody else, but they do not see the direct link how this affects their life. So I think that if we start raising awareness that we can, you know, live in a better tomorrow, this could probably help us all. So yeah, with this idealistic note, I would like to do that. Thank you.
Okay, so what we'll do now is, if it's okay with you guys, we'll just open up to some questions. I don't know, just Felix, is there any way of seeing if there's questions coming in online, just if you can monitor that?
I can check, yeah.
Yeah.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, please.
So a really brief statement and then a question. I managed to wrangle attend a meeting yesterday with Minister Helen in the County Centre in Kilkenny. He did, try his best to get a meeting, or to get time to come here to speak, but he sent his apologies. And then my question is, I suppose in more of an Irish context, corruption can kind of usually forms out of social circles, and you know, politicians and big business kind of do socialise in the same circles. So at what stage does social capital become corruption?
I'm actually, to be honest, I'm not sure what you mean by
social.
So,
I mean, so friend of friend, or you're doing friend a favour because you're in a social group, or that's the capital of your social standing. At what stage does that become corruption?
Yeah. But I should have said at the outset when I was talking about corruption in Ireland that we can categorise corruption in Ireland as it manifests itself, or as I see it manifesting itself in 3 categories. First, petty. I said earlier that we haven't really suffered from petty corruption in a long time, largely because of our professionalisation of the civil service and so on, and because of relative levels of economic welfare. Civil service, generally speaking, well paid enough. They don't have to extract rents and bribes from ordinary citizens. The second one is grand corruption, and we saw through the tribunals that we have had a history of grand corruption
senior civil servants or senior politicians taking money or abusing their power to some degree. The third, which I didn't talk about, which touches on your question, is legal corruption or lawful corruption. And I spoke earlier about how Ireland is ranked relatively high on the Corruption Perceptions Index, but I didn't say the Corruption Perceptions Index only measures one type of corruption, or corruption as is understood by legislators, which is abuse of power, the criminal abuse of power, generally speaking, private gain, and involves bribe taking, money laundering, embezzlements, and so on. Legal corruption involves the abuse of social capital to a large degree. It involves abuses that are not outlawed in legislation, and it can involve the trade in influence, trafficking in influence, which is what regulation of lobbying is meant to address. Now, I've said before that I don't think that the lobbying regulations go far enough to address this risk. For example, they don't allow us to see how much money is being paid to consultant lobbyists who are, it doesn't tell us much about the financial interests of those lobbying and those on whose behalf they're lobbying. We have had a history where politicians and business people have been too close together. We haven't addressed, for example, the abuse of revolving doors, the movement of civil servants and politicians into the private sector. And this has created, you might say, negative social capital that has led to failure to a large degree to regulate our private sector effectively. We had people moving from regulatory agencies into banks and back again. We had regulators who were very close to senior bank executives and who failed or refused to effectively regulate our banks to catastrophic consequences. So, to answer your question, we have suffered from an abuse of social capital, and I don't think we've gone far enough to address those abuses.
I think maybe you guys might have some kind of info on this, because you were talking about group thinking, about how dangerous that can be.
Yeah, I think some of the work we've done together on LEAPS tries to look at that. And I think this is the kind of area where activity by groups and transparency is so important. We did a study comparing cabinets in Ireland and the UK and where they came from, which schools. And there is quite a clustering of schools. I don't think our research really breaks the news on that. Okay, it was more a methodological paper. We were interested, we devised a particular measure, which isn't important here. But what is important is that it is undoubtedly the case that there is significant clustering from kind of age 12 of those with power in our societies. And this varies between societies, so we can make it better and we can make it worse. We need monitoring of it. One of the reasons that we did cabinets was partly because John's a political scientist and he tells me what to do a lot of the time, but it was also because the information was there. It was very easy to get information on where most politicians went to school from age, dot really, which I think is a good thing about politicians. I have tried to do it, for instance, on entrepreneurs. Ernst & Young hold a very good competition on entrepreneurs of the year in different countries. Trying to find out where such people go to school is extraordinarily difficult and speaks to the fact that in some areas of our society, power and how it arises is very opaque. And I think we need to shine light on that, and we need more information on that. I would also say, I think your question was very well put. How does social capital turn negative? We know social capital can be extraordinarily useful. We know in lending to poor communities, for instance, There's organisations like Kiva that have used the idea of social capital in order to provide financial services to small communities. And we shouldn't be all negative about social capital. LinkedIn, for instance, makes a fortune out of building social networks. Is this a valueless thing? No. But the trafficking in influence is definitely problematic. The unfair access, the idea that all politicians would be clustered, or most politicians would be clustered in schools from age 11 is very, very disturbing. So it's more the need to shine a light on this and to investigate it and to think about it than to declare it all to be negative that I would be concerned with.
Is that a fair representation
Yeah,
of where we're at?
and like when you take it up to the next level, to the university level, the clustering gets even more concentrated. So, you know, if you think in England Eton is bad, well, it's got nothing in Oxbridge for, you know, government ministers. And we have a similar problem here with the university I won't mention, but there's a real clustering, and the connections are fine, but like Brendan was also saying then, if you know that all these ministers come from this school, doesn't tell you what businessmen come from the exact same school and they were all in the same volleyball club or football club or rowing club together. You know, so those connections to know the connections are fine themselves, but to know about them and actually find out about them is very difficult. And then, like you said, could they be used, you know, bringing up your friends saying, you remember years ago when we were in that same club together, buddy, can you help me out in this situation?
Just a little anecdote, and I would caution that this is not an attack on the individuals concerned at all, okay? It's just a tale from the field, if you like. I was messing around with my internet one night and looking at the Entrepreneur of the Year awards in Ireland, and I find it really hard to get information on the businessmen. People have private lives, and I suppose they want to protect them. They have stories for their business to tell, and sometimes being an entrepreneur, it's very important to pretend that you fashioned yourself from the age of 1, so very often you don't want to admit your social capital. But I came across a wonderful photo of 2 winners in a private college, a fee-paying exclusive college, and along with them at age, it must have been, I think it was about 5th year, so what age would they, 16, 17? It was a picture of them and the minister who presented them with their awards. Okay. Now, I'm not suggesting anything nasty about those individuals, okay, or anything nasty about that process, but where we're told that the job creators must be respected and are self-made, I think we've a problem with getting information on that. There's a balance, obviously, to be struck between privacy for people, which they're generally entitled to, but also a social accountability in terms of watching that, you know, danger of closed and golden circles.
Do we have any other questions?
I would like to ask, like, in your opinion, how can we motivate the youth? Because it's in a sense discouraging or like saddened that a lot of youth, you know, when you speak, so you have your circle of very active, very motivated people, but when you know, just go a little bit broader, you kind of see a different picture of people, of youth who basically have no interest in anything. So in a sense, like in this circle of people who are interested in a lot of things and who would like to change something, who would like to see a better future or whatever, it's relatively small compared to, you know, all the other people who live. So how do you think, in your opinion, maybe from your experience, how can, you know, young people, how could they be motivated, you know, to bring some change? Because, for instance, I've spoken to people in Portugal and Spain, and like a lot of people, and like talking about corruption, a lot of people, they just see like, oh, corruption, you know, it's inevitable, it's natural, it's like in our blood, you know, so we can't do anything, and they just do not join any movement, you know, they do not see any you know, light in the future, you know, that how this could be changed. So they just like go on with the flow.
As somebody farthest, I think the person farthest away from youth in this panel, I think I should start, and then you can get to the more relevant answers. First of all, I mean, I don't want to prejudice anyone's involvement in this group and what's been happening in Ireland this week, but I mean, as an old fogey in my approaching 50, I can't speak highly enough of the enthusiasm in the youth in Ireland. I mean, what has been happening here in the last 3 weeks just blows away all that patronising, contemptuous talk from people of my generation about how the youth don't care and how the youth don't understand politics. And I think they understand it very well, and they wrought an incredible change. So the first thing I think is that, you know, there's a narrative among people with beards like mine, you're not quite as grey as mine, that somehow the 60s were the period where everything was changed and where the heroes and idealism was. I find my students to be much more realistic, much more honest with themselves about what they're prepared to sacrifice and they're prepared to do. So I would say there's a well of interest there if people see it as worthwhile. The second issue, I suppose, regards culture, and I think Ireland has a lot to offer in this respect. I mean, we are known as, if you like, the Latins of the North, with all those corrupt stereotypes that are attached to Latins, and we're even a pig these days in terms of, you know, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece and Spain, and how apparently we're much more genetically corrupt than lots of other people. So I think Ireland does have a role to play in terms of the period that John talked of, where Ireland nearly went down a very corrupt rabbit hole, and whereby political action we lifted ourselves out of. That kind of, I think we have a special gift. I think this chapter of the organisation will have a special gift to bring in terms of looking at that relationship between identity politics, nationalism, colonialism, in a way that I think other members of the chapter might find very useful in dealing with countries that aren't as successful as maybe some of the Nordic, Scandinavian, Germanic countries in dealing with corruption. Yeah, I think I've said as much as I can possibly risk saying about youth, so.
Well, I maybe the worst person to ask, because I haven't been engaging youth as much as I would have liked, in large part because I've focused, I found myself focusing on some of the technicalities of corruption and researching, developing tools, working with people of different age cohorts very often. And I mean, a lot of my colleagues, we have large chapters in Bangladesh who engage through concerts and cultural events. We get 30,000 people out on the street in Cambodia to fight against corruption. It has been done elsewhere, it just hasn't been done here yet. I think one of the problems, or one of the challenges you face here in Ireland is in convincing people that corruption is big enough a problem for them to worry about and to be motivated enough to do something about it. And the second challenge you then face is providing them with an opportunity to engage. And that's not easy. You have to be innovative. You need to be able to communicate the relevance of this campaign to ordinary people, and particularly to young people who might not see corruption as a big problem. And that has been a challenge in West. Everywhere we've worked at Transparency International, it's been a big problem for us, particularly in Western Europe and North America. We have relatively small chapters compared to our chapters in Bangladesh, where we have 300 staff. You know, Colombia, Kenya, big chapters, and they're bigger than Amnesty International. So we have a problem here in large part because people don't see it as relevant. And I disagree to some extent, Brendan, as far as I think corruption, we did go down that hole, and I think we're still stuck in a hole. I think Charles High, contrasted to what Vincent Brown might say, did enormous damage to political culture in this country. You point to the way in which our civil service was manipulated and to a large degree disempowered by politicians, even the revenue commissioners, Charles High. I think it's going to take years for that culture to be cleansed of
of the damage done by people like Hodl, and for that negative social capital to be addressed. It's still manifesting itself right now. We still have people who you can look at the work of Task, for example, who mapped Golden Circle. They produced a report not too long ago on the links between business and government, and looked at those social networks as well. And there's an awful lot to be done. It won't always be described as corruption, however, and you will meet a lot of people who say, well, this is going a little bit too far to call it corruption or to call those people corrupt. You will find yourself in the forecourts facing a defamation action if you brand people as corrupt, unless there's a de jure court finding against them. So you need to find a language, the right language, to communicate this problem to people and make them see the relevance of this problem to their daily lives.
I think what you said there was quite interesting, because I think it is going to be the way it is. In some regions, like in Bangladesh or Indonesia, we already have massive growth, and it's already, they're reaching into universities and people are flocking to it. And the majority of our likes and our interactions on social media is from them regions. So I mean, Edgar's is probably going to have one of the toughest jobs in trying to get people in Western Europe and North America moving on these kind of things. Because you were saying corruption essentially cost 30 billion to the Irish economy in one way or another through the bank bailout and the corruption involved in that. And people, it was a point we kind of discussed, because our history is actually came from a student festival, and one of the points that was raised that it was, are people willing to accept a certain degree of corruption if there is, a level of development? At what rate is it that people start going, our economic problems are because of corruption and not because of, we're not producing enough, we're not working hard enough, or all of these narratives. So it is going to be quite an interesting thing for Edgar's. So I'm just to see if anyone else has any questions. Yeah, please.
Just one issue, I suppose, that I was curious for you to address was how legislation ties in with corruption, because even though now, like you say, we're kind of crawling out of the rabbit hole a bit, but I don't know if there's been much reform in the legislation. Like the Planning and Development Act was a good example. That got totally rewritten in the 2000s, and in some ways I was rewriting that, I saw it facilitating the developers, because as a politician, the developers being the same people, and that facilitated and suited the developers, and I think had a huge negative financial impact on the country. I don't know if the legislation has been changed in some of the banking legislation and other legislation that, say, facilitated the sale of something that nobody ever talks about in Ireland, which is the sale of our oil and gas to Shell for a few million dollars into somebody's back pocket and their holiday fund. So just in terms of addressing the legislation that did facilitate the corruption and nepotism and everything that was going on, and future governments then having to change that doesn't seem to happen. People don't seem to think about that. Even if the legislation isn't directly facilitating corruption, it facilitated, suited, it was done to suit developers. And same with that other legislation that would work to buffer against easy selling of assets or the likes of telecoms. And it's something that I don't see talked about much. And maybe it's been talked about more than I realise, and apologies if that's the case, but just wondering what your feelings are on those topics. So even with the judiciary and how our judicial system functions or doesn't function as well, in terms of if you're saying accountability and the enforcing of legislation, and even just how our judges even rule or treat even the role of our judiciary in this process at all. The fact that we had to have these mock tribunals, which cost a lot of money, led to nothing as far as I could tell, at the expense of millions of billions to the exchequer as well. And the fact that we even had to have these tribunals, maybe I felt was a failing of our judicial system. Do we not have a judicial system that could deal with this? So I'm just wondering what your feelings on these topics.
Can I reply to some of that? I suspect my colleagues are better at it. But I think it does raise the point that John raised. It's the appropriate language to talk about this, because corruption can mean so many multi-layered things. But to me, something, a phrase from the very successful campaign that's just being run by the Yes people in the referendum, this point of equality, I think, is really important. Okay, because whether something is formally corrupt or not, or whether it's something just done in all good faith by a very close golden circle, in some ways, once you're away from the real petty kind of everyday life disrupting corruption. In a way, it doesn't matter. What you need is people to be able to find their voice and express their misgivings and their doubts about particular sales of state's assets, particular planning operations, and so on. So I think the fact that you're anti-corruption, what are the things that are anti-corruption? One of the things that anti-corruption is giving equal voice to people and protecting them against kind of, being looked over for promotion or advancement because they happen to speak their mind, and protecting those voices. I think that's a real thing that, Anti-Corruption International, particularly in Ireland, could take on. I am totally ignorant of the legislation on planning, so I won't attempt to indulge in that. Even I wouldn't go that far, given my level of ignorance. But I think, that's the way it has to be tackled. I would come back and absolutely acknowledge John's point. If I gave any impression that we fully recovered from the haughty years, that was mistaken, absolutely and utterly. I do think it's not as bad. I mean, during the height of the haughty period, I think we were looking at some very, we could have been a lot worse. That doesn't mean maybe the phrase out of the rabbit hole is a little too optimistic. But we're not as deeply down there as we once were. But I think the way to move it on is to focus on what makes anti-corruption, not just what makes corruption, but what makes anti-corruption. And to me, that is giving voice and making sure people are supported when they speak out. But there's a natural right to speak out. To take something I totally disagree with, I wish my union, which is the Teachers Union of Ireland, to be more supportive of change in monitoring, the way the schools are being asked to mark students' continuous assessment. I'm a great believer in continuous assessment. However, those teachers should be absolutely celebrated for the fact that they were concerned that this system would lead to a corrupt system. Instead, and in fairness, I don't think the government engaged in this, but instead some of the newspapers engaged in scurrilous attacks on teachers looking for their own interests and stuff, after their own interests, which I don't think was true. So I think it's giving a voice to people and making sure that too long on that.
I couldn't talk about planning laws, but all I could say really in relation to transparency legislation, and our own experience of that has been that when we look at other countries, once you bring in a lobbying law, it really usually sets the base, and then society tends to build upon it. It's like the Canadian laws have gone through, I think, 4 iterations since 1989. The American federal laws have gone through about 2 or 3 iterations since about 1946. And each iteration, the law tends to be stronger. It tends to fill loopholes that were found in earlier versions of the legislation. So lobbying tends to become stronger over time. Very few places we've seen it fall apart. I think it was in Hungary and in Australia were the only 2 places we ever saw it fall apart. Most places tend to get stronger. So I would think that in the Irish case that, the law is in now, and it will be kind of a foundation upon which to build. You won't see, like with the FOI, certain things being rolled back upon. That's not the tradition anyway, internationally with lobbying laws. So you get more transparency and more accountability, hopefully, in the lobbying process from now on. The one thing is, though, if you want to be corrupt, you will get corruption. I mean, we went to Washington State and we talked to people there, and they've got the strongest lobbying laws in the world there. I think at the time they had penalties of up to like $40 million if you engage in corrupt activity. And they said, despite the penalties and despite the fact you might go to prison for 5 years, people will still break the law if they think they can get away with it. So, no matter how strong you make your law, you will always have somebody who will try to get around it. Now, bless them, they could end up with 5 years, in prison, which might deter other people. So it might, the 99% of other people who might think they're doing something wrong might be deterred from it. There'll always be somebody who'll try it on.
I think the biggest pointed to earlier, the biggest step that we need to take is, the most important one we need to take is enforcement of laws that are already there. Now, I brought a copy of our National Integrity Systems Study, which we produced in 2009. We produced that with Elaine Byrne. We revised that in 2012. But it looks at how laws and institutions are working together to stop corruption in the whole. And we charted there were a 3-page list of measures introduced by government to tackle corruption. So in 2010 we reformed our corruption laws. We're due to introduce a new corruption law, the Criminal Justice Corruption Act or
anti-corruption bill is being prepared now. The Criminal Justice Act of 2011 meant that people had to report white-collar crime. The Protected Disclosures Act was introduced in July last year. The Lobbying Act. We've reformed local government, whereby local councillors can no longer interfere in planning decisions, duly interfere in planning decisions made by officials. Still have responsibility for rezoning, but the power to interfere or overrule planning officials has been curtailed to some degree. We have stronger curbs on funding to political parties, stronger requirements to disclose sources of income by political parties. So we've seen a lot of legislation brought into the statute books, but a lot of it isn't being enforced. And as I pointed to earlier, we have an appalling track record in putting people away for corruption-related offences. And there's a lot of research to show that people will engage in wrongdoing if they believe they can get away with it. And if the sanctions aren't punitive enough. I want to point to Siemens, the German engineering giant, which was fined in the region of $1.6 billion back in 2008, 2009. Around 2008, 2009. It was only when it was fined this amount and faced the risk of debarment from securing public contracts in the United States that it cleaned up its act. It had a slush fund within the company. You could go to someone in the company and take money to pay off public officials. They were caught bribing in 10 countries around the world, and corruption was systemic within the company. But it was only when they were caught that they did something about it. And I started out believing that corruption wasn't that big a problem here back in 2000, when I started 2003, 2004. And we've been running a helpline for whistleblowers and witnesses for the last 4 years. Corruption is a much bigger problem than I believed it was when I started out, or was led to believe it was. And it's manifests itself in a way that sometimes you can't call it corruption. So, as I said, you need to be very careful how you address this issue. It is a very, very complex but very rich topic and fascinating one at the same time.
Yeah, can I just make a point on that? I think something that was really interesting. You were talking about the enforcement of the legislation. I think as well. I think was the freedom of information. Was that a regulatory change, or was the freedom of information legislation changed?
It has changed again this year.
Yeah, because I don't have the exact numbers, but I do know that there has been a massive increase in the amount of freedom of information requests. So I think sometimes changes that can happen in legislation that aren't necessarily about enforcement, but about engaging civil society. That if you can actually make it easier for them to access information through the freedom of information legislation, they'll do it. And stuff has been coming out now recently that would not have been accessible to people previously because it was too expensive to get the requests. So I think it was a 15 or 25 euro now, I think, or something. So
yeah, the repeals, the cost of appeals, we've run into thousands of euros to get the information you wanted. Sometimes you'd have to make separate requests for related information. You weren't able to put it all into the one request. Then sometimes you'd have to appeal that to the information commissioner. It was 150 euros to appeal that, and if the public body decided that it wasn't going to disclose this information, the information commission might then have to take the public body to the High Court. It takes years to get this information. We have removed the fees, but the system is still largely the same. And you talk to senior civil servants who describe FOI, and one senior civil servant described FOI as a disaster. He said he doesn't put anything down on paper.
Yeah. I think the point is though that if we can frame our legislation in terms of corruption in a way that it'll actually empower civil society and citizens to come forward and like through whistleblowing legislation that we can. That'll be a roundabout way of getting to the problem. You know,
I think just on that point, most of these public interest requests are made by the media. Yeah. And the media generally have the resources or traditionally have had the resources to pursue a story. one area we really need to look at closely is media freedom here, both in terms of the ability of media to tell a story without the courts unduly interfering in that process, and media ownership, the ability of the journalist to tell a story that the editor and the owner of the newspaper will allow them to tell. And we've seen a very negative trend emerge in terms of media ownership here, and a refusal of government to address that problem. And there are linkages that need to be explored, need to be unravelled and exposed and addressed. And as I said, it's a complex area. You can't just look at one area in isolation. This is there are many different aspects to this problem that need to be addressed almost simultaneously. And it'll take some time, as I said, to unravel it and address it.
There are also one interesting examples, because it's kind of different to the Freedom of Information Act that it did engage the public. I was working in waste for a long time, and the council's Department of the Environment, they set up this hotline, public hotline, and for people to ring in to report. It was kind of a consequence of the bin charges. They were seeing like people were dumping rubbish around the place. So they set up this hotline thinking, okay, we'll have this hotline for people to ring in if they see Maggie putting their rubbish in their bin that they can report them. But actually what they didn't anticipate was the hotline actually created a tidal wave of reports of illegal dumping on a much larger scale than just, my neighbour chucking some rubbish over the back fence. And actually you started to reveal illegal landfills all over Wicklow, illegal landfills in the border regions. So many of the local governments were in chaos because they just thought this was just meant to be a little hotline for I saw some people with the truck out to Dublin Mountains. And then it's created a tidal wave of crisis almost because we started to investigate these. They thought they were small farmer with putting a few bits of rubbish down the back paddock, and they realised these were huge operations that had been going over 30 plus years. Small restaurants holding in the Wicklow Mountains was probably one of the biggest examples, involving not just small farmers but involving big companies like Cement and Holdings. And it also revealed other failures of our planning system, which was a thing called retrospective planning permission, whereby somebody could do something, oops, sorry, I built that, oh well, here you go, here's your planning permission anyway, retrospectively. So that was happening a lot with landfills, say, had illegal dumping sites. The government's reaction was, oh well, the rubbish is there anyway, here's your permit now to have an operating landfill. And it also was revealing things like when they actually went to investigate some of the sites, they realised that housing had actually, planning permission had actually been given on these areas that had operated as illegal landfills. And basically the farmer had used the waste to level their land, and then got the land rezoned by giving a few quid to Wicklow County Council and some of the Dublin councils to rezone the land for housing. So basically had a situation where people had built houses on illegal landfills. So this was the consequence of just setting up a public hotline which was meant to just expose people who were actually breaking the legislation as a consequence of the bin charges. They thought they were actually going to enforce the bin charges and stop people just, little people just dumping here and there casually. And this was one of the consequences of this hotline, which created mayhem. The councils were, oh crap, what do we do now about this? So I think it's an interesting example of how the public can be engaged in other ways. And it also really can show the failure of our planning system, which I feel like to get out of corruption, our current government needs to address these loopholes that Fianna Fáil left in the planning and left in all those sorts of legislation that facilitated all this kind of corruption. And the governments don't seem to have a tendency to realise they need to tighten up this legislation as another way of countering corruption. And the legislation was written to facilitate corruption, call it what you want, to facilitate all this planning mayhem that was going on. And until that legislation gets rewritten in the interest of the public, not in the interest of developers, I think we're not going to fully ever get out of the rabbit hole, because the legislation was written to suit developers, not the public interest in the past in Ireland.
I think what you find is, and we've had more complaints about planning officials, appointed officials, than elected officials. The Man Tribunal found that elected officials, county councillors, were taking money in the past to have land rezoned or to influence the outcome of a rezoning decision. Appointed officials are responsible for planning, and we've seen more complaints about appointed officials than elected officials. And the lesson learned here is that corruption is displaced very often by legislation. It moves from one area to another. It'll always be around. People will always abuse power if they have the incentive and the opportunity to do it. It's like any crime, or the inclination to do it. And the challenge is to identify the incentives and close the opportunities for people to engage in abuses, whether you call it corruption or not. I often just refer to it as abuse or abuse of power, because you can't always readily identify the private gain, that quid pro quo in a corrupt transaction. And legislation can go so far to close these loopholes, but others will open. And it's largely about creating the right incentives for people and stopping or closing the opportunities for people to abuse their office.
Do you think?
Question too was I was actually living in Australia for the last 4 years, and I was around when I don't know, call it what you will, Julia Gillard Cameron got ousted, or call it what you will, replaced by Julia Gillard, and I just watched the Australian media, which is a fantastic example of ownership. I mean, you know, we've got Fairfax Media owned by can't think of her name, the mining magnate anyway. She owns Fairfax Media, and then the Australian is basically backrolled by mining companies. So you've basically got two media outlets which are either owned directly by mining companies or backrolled by mining companies. And just watching the public, the onslaught through the private media of the mining tax that Kevin Rudd had proposed, and the consequences that ensued of Labour Party, you know, saying they've gotten rid of them or whatever, and then Julia Gillard being replaced and axing the mining tax altogether, softening it. So I don't know how you can kind of counter this, you know, with the availability of the media we have and companies to, I suppose, put as many ads as they like on TV. They can, you know, put a whole series on TV if they want to, paid by mining companies. We saw this with car manufacturers in the past, you know, sponsoring TV shows in America. So I don't know how can we, even though this isn't corruption, it's lobbying in a different way that no amount of maybe legislation can prevent. And the other consequence in Australia, for example, is huge. And seeing the current government now, which is spectacularly pro-mining, the Abbott government, and being around to watch all that happen as well. And you know, again, even with the best lobbying laws in the world, I don't know if you can come around these kind of problems and challenges.
I mean, one of the things that I mean, one change that I've seen, and it's very evident since I started in this space, is the emergence of social media. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook when I was starting out. And I trained in public relations, so everything went out through the newsrooms in press releases. Now, I mean, you can see with in the wake of the referendum, how social media can be harnessed to complement, I wouldn't say necessarily replace the role of traditional media, to complement that and to counter narratives by traditional media. And we had a big job to do in countering narrative. Some newspapers around the Garda whistleblowers, those newspapers and the state broadcaster were being fed lines or lies by senior Gardaí about two whistleblowers. And we had to use traditional media as well as social media to get the word out about them and work with others in standing up for these two people. I don't think we're going to overcome the problems or issues surrounding media ownership anytime soon. I mean, the quickest way of counteracting that is through non-traditional forms of media communication. That's
in the case of Australia, was the TV, the ads were strongest on television. You know, maybe it also shows, even when we have all the social media around, TV is still, I think, a huge influencer. I just watched, like, literally you had the HB Belton and other mining companies every 15 minutes having ads on every private media channel in Australia. And that was just relentless, like 24/7. every 15 minutes basically telling us, the Australian public, that the mining tax was going to destroy the Australian economy, was going to make them all unemployed. And that was every 15 minutes. That was intense. So even for anyone who knows that all the arguments about the mining companies, even for you just to deal with that, I was almost starting to get won over, but brainwashed, I felt like, by this onslaught. I was working in a place where the TV was on. I was working in a hotel at the time. The TV was just on all the time. So, and people were just being swayed left, right, and centre by this onslaught on the TV. And I don't know, even with all the best social media in the world, it just couldn't buffer.
We don't have that problem to the same extent in Ireland. The Broadcasting Act outlaws political advertising here, and we would never get an ad on radio or TV to promote anti-corruption. So you can't do this. You can't engage in the same kind of lobbying using TV or radio that you can in the US or in Australia or elsewhere. So in some respects, we're very lucky. Just knowing my Russian colleagues are under enormous pressure now with Putin having introduced a new law that will potentially outlaw Transparency International and Amnesty International in Russia. Up until now, they've had to brand themselves foreign agents in Russian. That's translated as a spy. You have to put that on your website because they're receiving foreign funding. So we're working in a more enabling environment here than we might sometimes give ourselves credit for. There's an opportunity there for us to reach out to people that others don't have. And in spite of all the problems we have with media ownership as well, there are still outlets that we can use. And non-traditional outlets like the Journal or the Broadsheet and others that are interested in pursuing these kind of stories.
I think it is quite interesting though the way you're speaking of, because it's essentially, you were talking about abuse of power and how that kind of factors in, and it's essentially trying to get the turkeys to vote for Christmas kind of thing. You're essentially asking the people who are the most susceptible or most prone to corruption to actually vote to cancel corruption. And you were saying how corruption can move quite a bit, and it's quite translucent, it'll go from one side to the other depending on how the legislation changes. But it's interesting though, because I've been quite interested to hear what you guys think of what role. I mean, it was kind of alluded to in a lot of questions that came forward in what role citizens have to play, because this whole notion that we elect our politicians, they'll act in our best interest, they'll only do what's right for us, and then they'll move on. I think one of the main components of Anti-Corruption International, I alluded to in the speech, was about empowerment. I think it's about empowering people to start questioning these, empowering people to start seeing that you don't just elect a politician, he'll solve all the corruption problems, and then you move on. And another thing was what Ed Chris was talking about. He says our role here will also be to assist and to kind of facilitate development in other regions, like in, say, for example, Uganda or the Philippines, where within a couple of weeks we had people writing to us saying, what level of protection can you offer us? We could be in some serious trouble here, and if we pop our heads too high with power pay, and there's that kind of thing. So I think it's quite interesting. I'd be interested to hear what opinions you have on how to empower citizens to deliver change. I think that would maybe be more relevant to our work than